Hey now Brawlers, today we're going to take a look at Tide of Iron, Next Wave from 1A Games. Now this edition of Tide of Iron is new, but Tide of Iron itself is not. It's been out for a number of years. It was originally published from Fantasy Flight Games, and 1A Games picked up the license when Fantasy Flight was going to drop it, and they're publishing it on their own now. From what I understand, I've never played the original version, but I did play with someone who had played the original version. Most of what's in this edition is the same. All the components and the tiles are the same. The rules are a bit more streamlined, and they shrunk it down into a much more reasonable box. The older edition was in one of Fantasy Flight's notorious coffin boxes like Twilight Imperium comes in, which was good for when you had a lot of expansions, but not good for the base game itself. But anyways, just keep that in mind as we go forward. I've never played the original edition. I am new to this. What Tide of Iron, any Tide of Iron is a simulation of World War II, specifically the Americans versus the Germans. You set up different scenarios illustrating different historical battles of World War II. You'll put out all these different tiles that the book will tell you to and set up all of your troops and squads. You have tanks, infantry, trucks, mortars, things, all of these different things to simulate combat. And of course, you could just set them up however you like. It doesn't have to be a scenario either. And it's really meant to be played with 2 players, but you could go up to 4 players if with 2 people playing as a team, taking control of different divisions, things like that. So let's go ahead and do a very brief overview of how the game is played. I just want to give you a feel for what it's like with one of the simpler scenarios. Then we're going to come back and I'll give you my final thoughts. Okay, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of Tide of Iron. This is a competitive strategic war game for 2 to 4 players, although really the game is meant to be a 2-player game. You can just sort of do some scenarios as 3 or 4 player games if you want to. Now, there is no way I could go over every single detail of this game. In just the base game alone, you get a ton of stuff. I wish I could go over everything, but the overview would be an hour long. Just know that the game comes with 3 rule books. Well, not really. One of the books is actually an introductory scenario guide, which I highly recommend you go through. It'll run you through a few different scenarios, each time adding more rules to the game, and it's a very, very cool way to learn the game. It also comes with a complete rules of playbook and the tools of war book, which includes some advanced rules and component overviews that weren't necessarily in the rules of playbook, and also the different scenarios of the game. Now, you can make up your own scenarios in this game, but you should probably at least start off after you go through the introductory scenarios using some of the ones that they actually provide for you in the Tools of War book. So, for instance, this is the first scenario that I set up here, and this is called the Normandy Farm scenario. This is a very accurate World War II game, so all these different battles they describe here actually took place in some way, shape, or form. And this is for a 2-player setup, obviously. One side is the Americans, one side is the Germans. Now, with other expansions for this game, which they've already got some out for the old edition of the game, which I'm pretty sure from the friend that I played with that had played the old edition are fully compatible with this, or I believe they'll be re-releasing new editions of all the expansions as well. But when those come out, you'll be able to play as the different factions that were involved in World War II, the different Axis and Allies nations. But this is just the Americans and the Germans. So this is, you'll follow the scenario guide as to how you set up using the tiles. You'll have the tiles, will tell you what your squad makeups are, and the way that you make up your squads, you'll have little squad bases, and you'll actually have, you'll have multiple colors for the bases if you want to use, if you want to play a 3 or 4 player game. That's how you'll keep track of who's each different player. So there's light green bases for these as well. And each squad can only consist of 4 squad members, and like these are infantry right here. The German and American soldiers look the same as far as the miniatures go, and they'll tell you what kind of troops they are. So if they're holding the rifles like this, they're the infantry. The Americans in this scenario, it'll tell you which squad members you're using in particular, unless you're setting up your own scenario. In this one, here's the mortar guys. They're lined up there. And then you have some specialized troops. I don't want to take him off the base, but because sometimes it's hard to get him back on the base. But this guy that's holding the rifle at his midsection is an elite infantry who gets some bonuses. And then we have an officer, who's this guy in the back who's not really pointing his gun at anything, who will really help your team out a lot. So the Americans in this scenario start off over here, and here are the Germans. Like I said, they're the same colors and mostly the same troops, except that the Germans in this scenario get a machine gun guy who is right there. I'm sorry, I don't know all the proper terminology that I should. And you'll notice that there's different terrain on the map as well. Like here's hills and mounds, which are difficult terrain, which will be harder for you to move through. You have forest areas. You have houses, which will provide cover as well. Now, the goal of this scenario is for the Americans to take the objective point, which is this like mansion or huge base here that the Germans have occupied. But they have a very limited amount of time to do it. In this scenario, you only have until round 4 to do it. If one side does not either wipe out the other side, or if the Americans don't take the strategic point, by the end of the 4th round, the game is over and the Germans will have won. Now, you have a little compass here which will tell you true north for some certain artillery effects, things like that. You might also be wondering what these cards are. These are command cards. This is a whole other section of the game, which is optional, but it's kind of cool, so I figured I'd throw them out here. The command deck, the scenario will tell you which ones you're going to use. So you have command decks. The Germans actually have the morale deck in this scenario. And it'll tell you how many you start off with in play. And then at a certain point, you can use command tokens, which I'm sorry, I forgot to take them out of the bag. The command tokens you can use to pay for the command cards and get special abilities for doing so. For instance, the one I start off with being the Americans, the surprise assault. During the command phase, which is the first phase of the game, when you determine who has control of objectives, you can place this in your play area, and then immediately before your opponent takes an action, you may discard this card to take one action. But it costs you a command cost of 1. So if you had acquired command tokens before, you can use them to pay for that card during that phase. You're going to get those command points by taking control of strategic points around the board. So in this scenario here, we have a 2. This is for the Americans. Then you have other command 1 points, and there's for the Germans as well. If you're able to occupy those spots with your squads, you'll get command points during every command phase, which is how you're going to pay for those cards. So it could be an edge for you if you want to do that. But the main meat of the game is actually the action phase. Now, this is again when the scenario is going to tell you how many actions you get. In this scenario, it's 1 action. And what that means is that it's going to go back and forth with whoever is the starting player and has the cool starting player gun. You're going to take 1 action, which is essentially manipulating 1 squad. Then it's going to go to the next player. They'll take 1 action, and so on until you've used up all of your squads and therefore all of your actions. Now, whenever you use an action, you'll fatigue your unit. So it'll start off like this is one of the ready command units, or I'm sorry, that's actually for op fire, I believe. And then whenever you fatigue the unit, you'll put this token next to them, showing that you've used them already. So there's a ton of different actions you can do on your turn. So one of them is simply to advance. So let's say it was the Americans' turn. I can decide to advance one of my squads based on whatever their movement is. Now the game provides handy-dandy reference sheets, which you're going to be referring to a lot, because every single type of troop in the game has different movement, different armor, different firepower. There are military units, which I don't even have out here, which will also have their own stats as well. So you're going to need to keep track of all of those. But whatever your movement value is for your squad, you'll move that many spaces. Again, you may be hindered by blocking terrain, which will cost you penalties of movement. And that's it. That's what you can do for your whole action if you want to. Now, you can also choose to stay where you are and fire. This would be called concentrated fire, and this is where you're actually aiming at a particular unit that's within range of you, and figuring out what your firepower is and rolling dice in order to attack the unit. Now, the cool thing about concentrated firepower is that by doing so, which means you haven't done anything else on your turn, with that action, you're able to fire your entire firepower at him. You get 1 firepower, which basically amounts to dice per infantry unit. You get 2 for an elite infantry, and I do have an elite infantry in the squad. I know it's kind of hard to see from that distance. And then I also have an officer in that squad, which is still just counts as an infantry as far as firepower go. But the officer is cool because it gives you a fast recovery ability whenever you get disrupted, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And also it gives you faster movement as well. So having an officer is really good, even though he might not be as strong as, say, the elite infantry, who gives you an extra firepower. So once you make the decision to attack, you need to add up your range. So you'll look at whatever the range is for your particular unit. And that's where things get interesting too, because even if you're within range, you could actually, you might want to be closer, because you hit, your successes hit on lower numbers depending on what your range is. If you're adjacent, you actually hit on 4, 5, or 6. If you're at medium range, then which is anything up to your range value, you hit on 5s or 6s. But if you're anything past that, you only hit on 6s. So the closer you are, the better. Although, of course, that's putting you within range of the enemy. If you don't take them out, they're going to have the same benefit against you. Whatever you decide to do... Oh, I'm sorry. One other benefit of concentrated fire. If there are unexhausted or unfatigued units that are close to you that are also within range of the target you're trying to hit, they get to, for your action, they get to add half of their firepower and therefore, but then become fatigued themselves to your attack. So if you want to make one all-out go-for-it attack, that's the way to do it. But regardless, you'll add up whatever many dice you have. So for this squad here, I'm going to have a total of 5 dice. Then I have to calculate defense. Now, having infantry out in the middle of an open area like this is bad. They don't really have any defense dice to speak of because they're just infantry and they're out in the middle of nowhere. But had this squad that I've been targeting been in this building, well, now they have cover, and now that's different. Because for every cover, depending on the cover that they have, they're going to get to add defense dice to their roll. And also for vehicles that actually have an armor rating, and also I believe there might be some other advanced units that have that as well, then you get to add whatever their armor rating is to their red dice as well. But let's say, for sake of argument, just as an example, you have 2 defense dice and 5 of the attack dice. You're going to roll all of that. Now you're going to add up. Let's say that we were adjacent. So now I hit on 4s, 5s, and 6s. Defense is always 5 and 6s are counted as successes. Doesn't matter what the number really is. As long as it's a success, you're comparing successes to successes. So this was good for the defense. I have a total of 4 successes, but the defense has 2. So those are going to cancel each other out. But I'm still left as the attacker with 2 successes, which means I get to take out 2 of these guys. Now, that's if I had chosen to do normal fire. Now, I have another option I can do with my attack as well, and that is to have suppression fire. What that means, if I'm successful and I have enough successes that are not defended against, I can choose to put down one of these tokens indicating that they have been suppressed. What that means is that they're going to lose their action for the turn, which means that it's beneficial to do it when they haven't actually acted yet. Now, if you attack someone who's already been suppressed, you actually have the chance of disrupting them. Disrupting them is even worse because it means they're going to lose their next action as well when you get to the next round and reset. So essentially what will happen is if they're just suppressed, their turn will come up and they'll remove the token. But if they're disrupted, they just flip their token back over to the suppressed side. But you have to make that decision as to what you're going to do, because with normal fire, it can be very tough to take out an entire squad, which means they still get to act. They might be weaker, but they still get to act. Whereas suppressing is a little bit easier because you just basically deny them their action, but of course you're not making any headway in taking them out completely. Unless, of course, you do a suppression action when they're already disrupted, in which case they're completely routed. So that can happen too, you just remove them from the board. But every time that you take out members of a squad, of course, they get weaker, so that's a benefit as well. Now, I'm just going to describe a couple of the other actions that you can do that are most common. One is that you can do a fire movement. That's when you want to move and take your entire, and also fire as well, instead of just doing either one or the other. Now, you can do that, but there's a couple of penalties. One is that you have 1 fewer movement point than if you had just done a normal move by itself. The other is that you have to have your firepower, which can make a significant difference. But again, that's a move that you might want to do when you're trying to suppress or you really, really want to make an attack. You also can't make a long-range attack if you try to do this method. The other thing that you can do with one of your actions, among other things, I'm just not going to go into all of them, and I mentioned this very briefly, is go into op fire mode. If you go into op fire mode, you are using your action to delay your action, essentially. Or if to put it in D&D terms, you're readying an action. What you're readying is a fire, which means that as soon as an enemy squad or any other type of unit, actually in this scenario, the Germans are more likely to do that for sure, you're readying an action so that when someone comes into your range, you fire on them. So also, if you played Space Hulk, it's what's it called? I forget, but the Space Hulk has the same mechanic. If these games have any similarity whatsoever, that's it. So that's a brief overview of how the combat would work in this game. There's so many other things I could go into. Vehicle combat. Well, here, let me show you. You have all of these cool tanks, and there's like 3 different tanks for each faction, and there's all kinds of other different special units and abilities depending on the scenario. You can put together tons of these different tiles. All these tiles are double-sided. You have tons of different options. Combine them all together, have a mass scale game. You can do a 4-player game with teams. You can do a 3-player game and do basically 1 versus all, where there's 1 unit that has a strategic advantage and there's 2 other players working against them. And you can make your own scenarios. You can do all these different types of things, go through all the famous battles between the American forces in particular and the German forces in particular during World War II. I wish I could touch on more, I just don't have time. But that, in a very small nutshell, is Tide of Iron. Now, the theme of Tide of Iron, I'll be honest, is not something I'm totally into, and it has less to do with the game and more about the fact that I'm just not into historical war settings. I kind of knew that going into this. I'm more into fantasy and sci-fi, that's pretty obvious, or at least modern-day settings. But having said that, I do think that the theme comes out very well from the game, and it's all about the little things. It's about how the units move and interact on the map and all the different actions you can take. Like little things like doing the suppression fire and pinning down your troops and taking strategic objectives and how the terrain interacts with your troops and what they all can do and what their special powers all are. Like how a mortar can use one of your other troops' line of sight in order to fire. That makes sense. Like fire over there, like you're pointing it out. Those little things really do it really steeps you into the combat. And so I totally got that feeling, even though I'm not necessarily in love with the setting itself. And so I can understand that for someone who really is into the setting, like my friend that I played with who had played the original and is more into war games than I am, I can understand why they would just love the whole concept of how it all plays out. Component-wise, it's impressive in some ways, and in some ways not impressive. I mean, when you first bust open the box, you have this huge bag of plastic, all of these tanks and these troops. You're like, what is this? And these big, thick, heavy tiles, and that all is pretty cool. And the tiles really are very well done. You don't have any kind of bendy tiles here, at least not as far as the copy that I have. It looks really good. The artwork looks good. And I do like some of the plastic troops, like the tanks and things like that, but as far as the little infantrymen and how you put them into the squad bases, that was probably the biggest sticking point that I had with the components, because I'm not sure if this is how every copy of this edition is or if the old edition was like this as well, but most of the troops just did not fit inside of the bases because of the little plug on the bottom of them was just like kind of warped or malformed for a ton of them. So every time we had to make new squads and put them in the bases, there was a period of time where just like, this one doesn't work. Okay, try this one. Okay, that doesn't work. Okay, try this one. Oh, that one fits. And I don't know, maybe it's kind of nitpicking, but it was kind of annoying. And the infantry troops themselves don't look very impressive. Droopy guns, things like that. But when you have it all set up and you have these cool tiles, and especially when you're playing one of the bigger scenarios and tons of troops in a 4-player game especially, it looks pretty impressive. So I got to give it to them on that. I can't really fault them too much for that. There's only so much you could do with the miniatures without the game costing like $200. So I kind of understand it in that point. Mechanically speaking, and I touched on this a little bit when I was talking about the theme, I really like how all the troops interact, and especially like how simple it is, because going into this not really having a war game background, not playing, well, I probably never played a genuine war game, to be honest with you. And I kind of said this in the beginning, I would call this a war game. I know there's some debate over what the definition of a war game is, either in quotations or with a capital W, but this has got to classify. But I just think that this is more on the lighter side. It's not necessarily a light game. The first time that you play it, and I do heartily recommend going through the introductory scenarios that slowly ease you into the game. It really helps out a lot. I like how they do that, and I wish more games did something like that. But even then, there's a lot to take in. And when you get to the more complex scenarios, and when you get into 4-player matches, which I don't necessarily recommend, I think this is supposed to be a 2-player game, really. When you get into that, it can get pretty heavy. But as far as war games go, I think this is definitely on the lighter side. Like I said, this is a board game version of a war game. And you can make it as complex or non-complex as you want it to be. And I like that. I like that if you really want something heavier and longer, you can set up a scenario that's going to take you 4 hours, or you can just sit there and have a skirmish with some tanks, like in the introductory scenario, and have it done in like 45 minutes or less, depending on how you play and how well it goes for your side. And as far as that goes and how well things are going, there is a ton of luck in this game. I mean, you're rolling dice. It comes with a whole bunch of little dice, and you will be rolling them a lot for all the different things that you do. But it would be selling the game short to say that because of that, it's all luck-based. There's a deep amount of tactical strategy involved in this game. And I found that most of it comes from deciding how to either go for the kill, to pin people down, to rush in and charge, depending on if there's a lot of the scenarios have a time limit. One of the sides needs to complete their objective before a certain amount of rounds pass, and that puts such a tremendous amount of pressure on you to get things done, while at the same time, how are you going to go about it? Are you going to charge straight through? Are you going to pin, suppress? Are you going to shoot? They don't seem like major decisions, but they really, really are. And how you place your troops, and how you place your officers, how you make the best use of your tanks. All of these different things can seem very heady, and they are, but I think that it makes the game exciting at times. There are times where the game is just like, you're just in it. Like, you're just like thinking over every single move, and it can be, but at the same time, it's not really analysis paralysis prone, because you've only got one activation on your turn. And, depending on the scenario, you might have more than one, but a lot of scenarios you only have the one, and it's like, well, I can only do one thing here. What is the most important critical thing I have to do right now? And just do it and hope for the best and decide what to do with this squad or with this tank or with this truck. And it just works. It feels very, very cool. Having said that, this game, it's not totally my speed, and I really think for me, it shines on the easier scenarios. I'm just not really willing to commit the amount of time and effort into some of the larger, grander scenarios with tons of units. And like I said, I did this with 4 players once, and it was just too long and fiddly to a degree, so I probably would not recommend doing it that way. But with 2 players, doing one of the briefer, if that's a word, scenarios, I think it works pretty well. Not totally my thing, because I'm not into the theme. I think that if this was themed differently, if it was like a sci-fi space combat, and there are games like that out there, I'd probably be way more into it. Or if it was fantasy units, maybe I've never played Battlelore, but maybe that's my version of this that I should really get into. But having said that, I think that if you like the theme a lot, but you haven't wanted to dive into one of these uber complex hex encounter war games, you should have already have played this by now. This would be exactly what you need, as far as just you deciding how complex you want it to be, you deciding what you want to add. If you want to go through these historical battles, if you're really into the history of it, or if you're just really into the combat of it, I think that you can really find something in this game to pull out of and have a ton of fun with. And I can certainly understand why this is, I don't think it's been uber popular, but the people who love this game really love this game. I definitely have had another gentleman coming to my group for a long time who always wants to play it, because of those reasons, because he loves history and he loves the theme. And so if you're that type of person, this is your jam right here. And for me, even though I'm not into the theme, I still had fun with it, and I still think the mechanics are really, really solid, even though it is chucking a lot of dice, and even though the miniatures aren't the best in the world and it can go long at times, it's still a good, solid game. My name is Nick, this has been Board Game Brawl, and I'm reminding you to get out there and game every day and in every way. Take care.